When I was a little girl, I had a place that I would love to go to, where my dream came true and I was given a mother who loved and took perfect care of me. She took the role that my alcoholic and abusive mother once held, only she was perfect in every way. I even managed to get an older brother figure. All of this thanks to the mysterious and eccentric store owner, King Creole. I'm sure you've all connected the dots by now. My name is Olivia, and I'm trying to save my older brother Travis. When Travis sacrificed himself to save us from King Creole, I never once stopped thinking about him. Thinking about how terrible it was that he was trapped there forever without anyone to help him, under the clutches of the voodoo man who had seen fit to have given me my mom, and yet had taken my brother from me. I never once stopped looking for a way to save Travis, which led to getting in trouble with my mother, the police, and the schools I went to. I got in trouble a lot. My mom, Alexandra, eventually moved us away from the area where we had lived for so many ways, telling me that trying to save Travis was a hopeless endeavor. But I never gave up. As I entered my senior year of high school, I finally at least accomplished one thing I had always hoped I could do. I managed to get into Travis's computer and phone. And from there I learned all the things that Creole had done to Travis, and what Travis had become and how he ended up living with us, after murdering his parents and almost killing me and my mom. It was a painful revelation, and I don't blame Mom for never telling me. Some things are better kept away from the scrappy kid ready to beat up anyone to get her brother back. What do you think, Tempe? I asked my little template voodoo doll friend as I scrolled on Travis's laptop. He has been my constant companion over the years, my best friend and my fellow troublemaker. I've gotten him damaged over the years, but I always made sure to repair him with my decent sewing abilities. He gave me a little shrug as he walked across the table and scribbled something on the notepad that I had given him to write on. Looking over, all I saw was pretty much what he had already told me. No idea. Sighing, I turned the computer off and went about doing my homework, watching as Tempe walked around my desk fixing everything up a bit. I smiled at him as I scribbled down on my math homework. Olivia. Dinner. Mom called out after an hour. More than happy to stop doing this algebra homework, I held my palm out for Tempe to crawl into, and we both headed downstairs to eat whatever Mom had cooked. Despite being in the modern world for a decade, Mom still wears her big Victorian dresses. Not that I'm complaining, of course, she always looks freaking fantastic. Thanks, Mom, I told her as she sat a plate of spaghetti in front of me. She then sat across the table from me and stared at me as I ate the spaghetti put in front of me. Now, Mom usually stares at me while I eat, but this stare was lasting a lot more than it usually does. Looking up at her, I put my fork down to look at her. Everything okay, Mom? I asked her, which seemed to catch her off guard as she looked down at her hands and started to fiddle with them. Sweetheart, are you all right? She asked me. Not a question I was at all expecting to come from her. I looked at her a bit confused as I spun my fork around in a circle in my spaghetti, thinking about how she could think that I wasn't all right. Seemingly thinking that as well, she reached out her hand to touch mine. These past few nights you've been tossing and screaming in bed. Oh, that. I said awkwardly, picking up my fork and watching in annoyance as all the noodles slipped and fell off of it. It was true that for the past few weeks I had been suffering from horrible nightmares. While the details were always hard to go back to, I knew that they involved Travis and what Creole was doing to him for all these years. Yeah, I just have been having some nightmares, Mom. No biggie at all, I said, avoiding her eye contact as I tried again to eat. You know you can tell me anything, sweetie pie, she told me, which really hit me in the heart. I hated lying to my mom, and her overwhelming sweetness didn't help in that regard at all. But I managed to finally eat my spaghetti while she stood up and went about washing the dishes. Looking over at Tempe, I could tell that he wasn't happy about my little lie either. But I shrugged it off as I finished up eating and went back up to my room to finish off my homework. Spending a few minutes to look back at Travis's logs, I sighed and shook my head at the horrible details. And I couldn't help but smile as I read about how he described me when I had been a little girl. He made me look so innocent and full of life. Guess not much has changed. Stretching as I turned off my computer, I got ready for bed, putting Tempe on the nightstand next to my bed and laying down on my mattress. When I woke up in a cold sweat and clutching my blankets, I knew I had had another nightmare. Only this time I had the common sense to actually write it down in my journal. I dreamt that I had gone back to the half-priced Voodoo store. It was just like I remembered every time I pictured it. Looking abandoned and yet ready to receive any guest that might venture inside of it. Walking into the shop, I went straight to the counter expecting to see Travis, but I didn't. No one at all was inside. Taking a few more steps inside, I was suddenly grabbed at from the shadows by an unseen creature. Little Miss Olivia called to me, in a nickname that I knew only one other person had ever called me before. Looking over at him, I let out a scream at the pale face and button eyes that stared back at me. And that's when I had jerked awake. I went to school the next day in less than high spirits. Tempe was safely in my backpack as I went about with my classes. My dream nagging me in the back of my mind all the while. But at the very least, nothing terrible happened to me at school. It just went by in the usual blur it always does, with the added effect of me thinking about the Voodoo store. During lunch, while my friends talked about our upcoming SAT tests, I pulled my phone out and checked my map, looking for the Voodoo store. I didn't expect to find any, but to my surprise, I saw that there was one just down the street from the school. Mama DuPont's Voodoo Emporium, I said quietly to myself, looking around to make sure no one had heard me say that. Looking back at my phone, I sent Mom a text telling her I was going to hang out with my friends after school. The guilt still tearing at me for lying to her. But I needed to check the store out. When the bell finally rang, I nearly bolted out of the school. Tempe was less than happy at me for venturing towards a Voodoo store. Look, I just need to see this place. I need to see if she knows King Creole. Since you and Mom won't help, I might as well ask another Voodoo person, I said, unable to think of the word to describe someone who does voodoo. I guess maybe a voodooer. Arriving at the store, I saw it was nothing like the half-priced Voodoo store. It was neat and tidy and even like a cute antique shop. I had probably driven past it without even realizing what the cute shop had hidden inside of it. Holding Tempe in my hands like a protective cross, I walked into the store. A cute little bell jingled to announce my arrival. Well, hello there, sweetheart. Looking over at the counter, I saw a middle-aged African-American woman sitting at the counter with a big smile. Something about her just oozed sweetness, and my little bit of anxiety was driven away. I had a good feeling about her, so I gently lowered Tempe and approached the counter. Hello. Are you Mrs. DuPont? I asked her, a sort of hopeful smile. She let out a little chuckle and nodded a bit. That's Mama DuPont to you, sweetie, she said in a tone a grandma might have. She was sewing a voodoo doll in her hands and looking over at me. She was almost as skilled as King Creole was. Approaching her counter, I looked around at her nice and neat shop and felt like I could immediately talk to her about anything. Guess that's how to make an amazing shop atmosphere. I needed to ask you something, I told her, keeping Tempe below the counter and out of her eye range. What would that be, sweetie? She asked me, setting her unfinished doll on the counter and looking at me with her soft, loving eyes. Do you know anything about King Creole? I asked her. She stood up in absolute shock and knocked over a few items on her counter as she looked around quickly. She shushed me quickly and reached an arm out to grab me by the shoulder. Not in a malicious way, but like a parent catching their child from falling. Don't say that name. Sweetie, we do not speak of him at all. She told me, her eyes were dead serious as she told me this. Looking around, Mama DuPont motioned for me to follow her back to her office. Still trusting her, I walked over with her as she shut the door and mumbled something in French. I am sorry. I just want to know. I was interrupted by her as she raised her hand up to silence me. She finished her mumbling and let out a little sigh. Coming over to me, she offered a smile and pulled out a chair for me to sit on. We do not speak of him. What he does with voodoo is a crime against our entire way of life. she said with a sigh, before looking over at me. You want to know where he is, don't ya? She asked me, sitting across from me, and running a hand through her black hair. I thought I recognized that little doll of yours. It's you in there, isn't it, Charlie? She asked the doll, to which Tempe squirmed in my hands, and offered her a nod. You know him? I asked her, to which she offered a chuckle and shook her head. No, not personally. But my mama was best friends with his mother. Mama Creole and my Mama DuPont were the best of friends. When she said that, Tempe started squirming and I sat him on the table next to us. Mama DuPont took one look at him and gave a nod. So, what does a sweet girl like you want with King Creole? I hope you don't mean to ask for a wish. She told me, taking my hands into hers and holding them. I smiled at her and shook my head. I had already gotten away with a wish as a kid. Don't think Creole would even entertain the idea of giving me a wish after all. I want to rescue my brother from him, I told her. She raised a brow at me and let go of my hands. Looking over at Tempe, the little doll nodded back at her, and Mama DuPont looked back at me with a look that was a mix of sadness and amusement. I don't think I'll be able to dissuade you from your current path. She sighed, lifting her hands up and taking the necklace she was wearing off, and handing it to me. If you must go there, please wear this. It'll keep you protected from anything he might do to you, she said, standing up and stretching. She saw I was looking at the necklace with suspicion, and let out an awkward chuckle. It's safe, I promise. Voodoo is meant to protect, not harm like how he has perverted it, she explained, taking the necklace, and wrapping it around my neck. So, you do know where he is? I asked her, holding the necklace in my hands and twirling the small carving at the end. She nodded and walked over to her desk and rummaged through her desk. Giving a nervous sigh, she walked over and handed me a business card. We tend to like to know where he is. This was the address of his last shop. She told me, sitting across from me and looking at me with a motherly stare that I knew all too well. Promise me, sweetie Olivia. I interrupted. Not that I didn't mind her calling me sweetie, I just felt like I would take her warnings a bit more seriously, as long as she called me by my name. Olivia. Promise me that you'll get your brother out of there and never again mess with Creole and his cabal of horrible creatures. She told me, picking up Tempe and handing him back to me. I looked at her in confusion at the words she'd chosen to use. Cabal. I don't understand what you mean, I told her. To which she looked at me and I could tell that she had said too much. Standing up, she went over to her desk again and proceeded to pull out a small little notebook. I hope you won't have to come into contact with them. But this should help you if you do. Taking the notebook when she handed it to me, I opened it up and looked down at its contents, and raised a brow at it. It was filled with sketches and short descriptions of the images that were provided. Looking over at the card still in my hand, I was finally able to read the address in my mind out. It wasn't far from my house. Thank you for everything, Mama DuPont, I told her, standing up and shoving the notebook into my backpack. She was still staring at me with worry on her face. Just like my mom does whenever I so much as mention the half-priced Voodoo store. I promise I'll be safe, I told her with a smile. I believe you, Olivia. But I just don't trust what he'll do to you, she said softly, offering me her hands again. I accepted them and gave them a reassuring squeeze. Finally able to leave Mama DuPont's, I started on my way home. Walking home was nothing new to me since, despite her constant attempts, Mom could never figure out how to drive a car, and I still hadn't really felt the need to go and get my license. Should probably do that if I get the chance. Making it back home and past the worries of my mom, I ate dinner and went right upstairs to finish my homework and plan out how I was going to go to the half-priced Voodoo store. Taking out the notebook Mama DuPont had given me, I flipped through the sketches until I came upon King Creole's entry. This is a bad idea, Livy. Flinching and falling out of my chair, I looked around my room for the strange voice that suddenly appeared in the room. Looking over to the mattress, where I had left Tempe, I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw he was still sitting there. Although the figure sitting next to him in bed did leave me just a little bit freaked out. You must really not want me to do this, if you're coming out to talk to me, Charles, I told the tan man sitting on my bed. Charles Sumner, the man who had become King Creole. The man whose soul is trapped inside my voodoo doll. And my best friend in a weird way. But I need to save Travis. Livy, what if there isn't a Travis to save? He's been trapped there for over 10 years. It didn't even take that long to turn the boy into a murderer. I can't even imagine what I've turned him into now. His warnings weren't completely unfounded. I had been afraid of these thoughts, and had done my best to try and overcome them. I still have to try. If it was me who was trapped in there, he'd do anything to save me. He gave himself to Creole, just so I could have Mom back. I told him, tears starting to form at the corners of my eyes. Because of me, he's fucking stuck in hell. He doesn't deserve the Charlie. I told him, the tears falling freely as all my pent-up emotions came flooding through. You can't think like that, Livy, Charlie told me, reaching a hand out to me, and holding my cheek as he wiped the tears from my face. Travis loved you and Alexandra, so he gave himself up to protect the two of you. And as messed up as my other half is, he'll keep that end of the deal. But take Travis away from him, and he won't stop till he's hurt you beyond repair. Charlie warned me, as he wiped the few tears left in my eyes. I know, Charlie. I sniffled, looking at his soft, loving eyes before looking away and back to the notebook. But I still have to try and save him, I told him. Looking back and seeing that he was no longer there anymore. Sighing, I went back and decided to just turn in early for the night. Washing my face and changing into my PJs, I got into bed and closed my eyes to try and catch some sleep. Opening my eyes, I looked around in confusion as I suddenly found myself sitting in an auditorium. I had front row seats, and looking around I couldn't really tell what the other people around me looked at. But I didn't have time to really look at them as the lights dimmed and the curtains slid open. Ladies and gentlemen, a familiar southern voice exclaimed. Turning my eyes over to the stage, my heart dropped as I saw the pale, buttoned-eyed figure standing up on stage. King Creole in all his grotesque glory. How when I was a kid I wasn't terrified of him, I'll never figure out. He seemingly didn't notice me and just acted like I was another part of the crowd. For our main act, the one and only Travis. He called out as he pointed the crowd's attention up to the ceiling. I watched in silent horror as a body was lowered from the ceiling. Creole stepped out of the way as the body took its place of honor front and center stage. The spotlight shining on the mangled corpse. The mangled corpse of Travis. His body was contorted and broken in ways that a human body shouldn't bend. He was being suspended by the strings he so often wrote about. I think, my wonderful audience, that it's time to relieve Travis of his suffering. Don't y'all think? Creole asked the faceless audience, twirling his cane around in his hand. The audience all started to clap to signal their approval of the suggestion. Creole let out a cackle as he held his cane up in the air and brought it down on Travis's head, which shattered open like an egg, splattering his brain and gore all over the stage. I woke up screaming at the top of my lungs as I looked around to find myself back in my room. I panted hard, trying to catch my breath. I had barely managed to calm down when Mom broke through the door and quickly ran to my side. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" she asked in absolute worry. I looked at her, tears streaming down my face as I debated in my head about telling her. And I finally decided to do it, explaining to her the series of dreams I'd been having and the plan that I had hatched to free Travis. Needless to say, Mom was horrified. "Olivia, I can't let you go there. You're all I have in this world. I can't lose you," she told me, holding my face in her hands as tears started to form in her eyes. I knew that she loved me, but I never expected it to be so strong. I wrapped my arms around her and squeezed her. "I love you, Mommy. But I need to save Travis. Otherwise, I'll never be able to forgive myself for letting him sacrifice himself," I told her, looking at her with all the determination I could muster. She looked back at me, and I could tell that she knew that there was no changing my mind. But she still tried. "How are you even going to do that? Walk into the shop and drag him out? It won't be that simple, Olivia," she told me. Which was fair, since I didn't even know how I was going to go about doing it. On top of that, the only reason King Creole hasn't bothered us in almost a decade is because of Travis's sacrifice. She told me. I nodded and looked over at Tempe, who was also giving me a worried look. How are you even going to do that? Walk into the shop and drag him out? It won't be that simple, Olivia. She told me. Which was fair since I didn't even know how I was going to go about doing it. On top of that, the only reason King Creole hasn't bothered us in almost a decade is because of Travis's sacrifice. She told me. I nodded and looked over at Tempe, who was also giving me a worried look. Can I at least go and visit? To see if he's even still alive? I asked of her. She looked me over, knowing how stubborn I was. If you say no, I'm just gonna sneak out, I warned her. She let out a chuckle and we both started giggling together, and she finally nodded. Fine. But the second you see him, you come back home. Understand? She asked me, to which I readily agreed. She kissed me on the forehead and brushed a few stray blonde hairs back into place. Leaving me in my room as she went to go to sleep, I stayed awake staring at my desk, where the notebook and business card were. Giving a sigh, I got out of bed and started to get ready. Don't give me that look. She gave me permission. I told Tempe as I picked him up. He was giving a look of disapproval, but I simply put him in my backpack along with a notebook and a few items I thought I might need. Snacks, a phone charger, and a pair of socks. I also took a pocket knife that I had gotten for my birthday. Leaving Mom a note on my desk, I opened up the window and I snuck out of my house. Walking down the streets at midnight was sort of relaxing and only a little bit scary. The streetlights helped illuminate my path as I followed the map instructions on my phone for the half-priced Voodoo store. Alone with my thoughts as I walked towards my destination, I thought up a million other ways in which I could save and free Travis. None really got to the point where we could make it out of the door alive, but I was confident I could think of something. Soon though, my thinking was interrupted by the store I saw coming into frame. It was different from how I remembered, but the name was the same. All King Creole's half-priced Voodoo store. He really should think of a shorter name for his store. Taking a deep breath, I walked closer to the store and saw that they were open 24 hours. Stopping and pulling Tempe out of the bag, I held him close as I opened the door. I opened the door to find it wasn't Travis manning the counter. It was some random teenager, maybe my age. I didn't recognize him, but then again I didn't exactly pay much attention to anyone outside my friend group. Oh shit, someone actually comes in this late? He asked in surprise as I quickly shoved his phone in his pocket and looked over at me. I offered him a smile as I walked up to his counter and saw that his name according to his NAMA tag was John. Hey, sorry to bother you so late, I told him, my worry building since Travis wasn't manning the post he should have been. I was wondering, could I talk to your boss? I asked him, noticing that all the voodoo dolls were staring at me. I offered them all a wave, and they all seemingly calmed down and returned to their neutral stares. Yeah. You got a wish or something? John asked me, sitting up in his chair a bit. I didn't really, but I needed a reason to speak to King Creole, and this was the best way to do it. He nodded and stood up, giving himself a bit of a stretch. He walked over towards the office and knocked on the door. Travis, we got a wish. My heart dropped when he said that. And when the door opened and the figure stepped out of the office, I held my hands over my mouth, dropping Tempe to the floor. Someone has a wish, huh? If it's this late, it must be very important. The figure chuckled as he stepped fully into the light. His button eyes and stitches across his neck might have convinced someone that he was King Creole. But those red-painted cheeks and his face were enough for me to know that it wasn't the voodoo man. What can I help you with, miss? It was Travis. I stared in absolute shock at the figure standing before me. The face that I had grown up remembering and seeing in photos. The reason I was even in this store in the middle of the night. My brother Travis. Only now he stared at me with black button eyes and a wide smile that would have passed for one of King Creole's. "How can I help you, miss?" He asked me again, tilting his head and waiting for my answer. I wanted to try and scream at him that it was me, the whole reason he had sacrificed himself. But now all the air escaped my lungs, and I wasn't able to so much as make a noise somewhere between a gasp and a squeak. "She said she was looking for a wish," John said, breaking a silence that, while only lasting a few moments for them, felt like it had lasted 6 hours for me. Travis looked over at the store clerk and nodded, giving a nose exhale that I guess was a laugh, and looked at me. "Is that so? It must be important if you're in here this late." Travis chuckled, staring at me again and waiting for me to gain the ability to speak again. Looking him up and down, he wasn't dressed like King Creole. He had ditched his red tie and was now in a much sleeker suit. He looked like the textbook definition of a suave man in a suit. I finally managing to blurt something out, realizing I had dropped Tempe, I quickly bent down and picked him up, squeezing him to my chest for some kind of comfort and maybe even some protection from this stranger that looked like Travis. "I didn't expect you to be here, Travis," I finally managed to tell him. It seemingly caught him off guard as he raised a brow at me. "Really? Well, who exactly were you expecting? A ghost? Maybe Lucifer?" He snickered, looking down at me with a humorous grin. I took a deep breath and held his button-eyed gaze with my own. But he still seemed to not remember me. It did make sense. At this point he hadn't seen me in a whole decade. And I wasn't exactly the sweet little abused girl I used to be. "I was expecting to see King Creole," I told him after a bit. He was really caught off guard with that, looking around the shop like just mentioning the Voodoo man would cause him to appear before us. But soon he let out a strained chuckle and stared at me for much longer and with a changed expression. "He isn't really available at this time, but I would gladly take a message," he said with a smile. I stared back at him with a blank expression and took a deep breath, thinking over what I was even going to say. John meanwhile cleared his throat, pulling both of our attentions over to him. "Do you two know each other?" he asked, causing Travis to stare back at me and try and rack his head over who I even was. Like that thought had never passed through his head. I nodded at John, which really confused Travis. "Tell King Creole, little Miss Olivia says hi," I told him, turning around and heading to the exit of the shop. I didn't get that far before a hand reached out and grabbed me by the shoulder. I let out a surprised shriek as I was suddenly turned around and was face to face with Travis as he glared at me. I shook but soon matched his gaze to the best of my ability. "Oh, Olivia," he finally said, having at last figured out who I was. I nodded and offered him a peace sign with my free hand. I watched as he stared at me for a good while, a look of worry and remembrance on his face as he gripped me. Then suddenly that expression was changed to a smile that slowly grew across his face and stared at me. "Sir, are you okay?" John asked, probably just as creeped out as I was. Travis looked over at him and then at me, grabbing Tempe from my hands and tossing him to John quickly. Before I could even scream out for my doll, he grabbed me by the throat and began squeezing. I choked and coughed, grabbing him by the wrist and trying to wrench myself free. "John, be a good boy and hold on to that doll. And close up shop while you're at it. I'm closing up for the night," Travis gleefully said as he yanked me to the floor and started pulling me towards the office by my throat. It felt like at any moment he would tear my throat out with how hard he was holding me. He threw me into the office and slammed the door behind him as he entered the office. I wasn't able to do much except cough and gag, doing my best to fill my lungs up with oxygen. Travis walked around me and got a phone from his desk, holding the receiver from it and holding it up to his head as he waited. "Sir, great news. I have Olivia here," he said in pure excitement. nodding quickly as if Creel could see him. His smile just grew wider, and when he finally hung up he was in pure joy. "Oh, I'm so happy to see you again, Olivia. How have you been?" he asked me, coming over and grabbing my wrists, quickly tying it up with threads. "Travis, stop this." I finally managed to scream out after all my coughs and gasps, thrashing around as he tied me up and slammed me into the wall. "I came here to save you. Why are you doing this?" I screamed at him, but he offered me a confused look. "Why would I want to be saved?" he asked me. I stared at him in horror as he said that. "I love it here. I'm my own boss and have my own clerk to boss around. Not to mention King Creel even taught me a few tricks of the trade." He chuckled, walking behind his desk and sitting down. Sure, in the early years when I first gave myself up to him, he was just a tiny bit mean and abusive. But over time I started to learn that there was a reason for that. And that reason was that he cared for me. And that he was only punishing me when I did something bad. He said as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Travis, he fucking brainwashed you. This isn't you at all." I screamed at him, as if that would get it through to him, that this wasn't the Travis that I had known as a little girl. This wasn't the Travis who I considered my brother. This was almost like another King Creel. "Isn't it? I certainly feel like me," he told me, shrugging as he rubbed a chalk white hand through his brown hair. He watched me struggle through my binding and couldn't help but snicker at my struggle. A million things were going through my mind as my world came crashing down. "Sir," came John's panicked voice, pulling both of our attentions over towards Travis's office door. "The doll fucking stabbed me. And now I can't find it," he called out. The sound of frantic searching and struggle coming from the other side of the door brought a hopeful smile to my face. "That stupid doll," Travis muttered angrily, standing up from his chair and heading over to the door, opening it up and really getting angry now. "What the fuck did you do to my fucking store, boy?" he shouted at John, walking out of the door and slamming it closed behind him. Taking that opportunity, I quickly reached into my bag and started fishing through it, smiling when I found the pocket knife. Pulling it out and using my teeth to pull the blade out, I carefully flipped it around in my hands and sliced through the threads. Just as I got through the threads, something suddenly fell into my lap. Looking down in fear, I let out a huge sigh of relief when I saw it was Tempe. He stared up at me with a look of anger. "Look, I get it. But how was I supposed to know he would be like this?" I asked the doll, picking him up and holding him close as I quickly stood up and looked around the office, going over and locking the door. Finally, I started looking for a way out of the office. That didn't take too long since Travis had a window in his office. Although the problem was that he also had bars right outside the window. You think that someone who had been a prisoner for so long would at least have a regular window. My thoughts of escape were interrupted by the quick twisting of the doorknob. "Olivia, open the door. This isn't going to go well for you if you continue to resist," Travis told me, sounding like a frustrated parent with a disobeying child. He continued to try to open the door. Looking over to his desk, I noticed that he had left a key on the desk. Well, that was one thing going for me. As he continued to try and open the door, I kept thinking over how to get out of the situation I had gotten myself into. Finally, I went towards the window and opened it up, trying to tug on the bars and seeing how strong they were. There was definitely no way I was going to get through them like that, so I looked down at Tempe. "Any ideas?" I asked the doll, hoping for him to have some kind of idea. He took a look around the office and pointed over to the desk. Following his little stump, I walked behind Travis's desk and took a look down behind it. There wasn't anything there except for a sewing kit. Well, that wasn't going to help unless Travis and I wanted to make some arts and crafts. Well, that didn't work. I sighed, sitting Tempe on the desk and sitting down on Travis's chair. Tempe kept pointing at the desk, however. I sat up in the chair and opened the desk drawer, and quickly held my mouth closed to keep myself from vomiting. Staring back at me in the drawer were dozens of loose eyes, some that were squished, and others that were pristine and looked almost fake. I quickly shoved that drawer closed and stared at Tempe in anger. He looked up at me and kept pointing down at the desk. I really wanted to flick him in the face, but I dared to look through a few of the other drawers. "Okay, Olivia. Open this fucking door right now," Travis shouted from the other side, slamming his fists against it, and still trying to get through it. I paid him no mind and opened up the next drawer and looked down at its contents. Staring back at me in this drawer was a small doll. Raising a brow at that, I picked it up from its little home and stared at it. It was another template doll, but unlike Tempe, this one was a real template. Just a normal voodoo doll. "You want me to make a voodoo doll of Travis?" "Tempe, I don't think we have the time for that," I told him, sitting the doll on the table next to him. He looked over at it, and shook his little head. I racked my head trying to figure out what Tempe wanted from me, until I finally figured it out after looking back and forth between the two of them. The doll looked exactly like him. Picking Tempe up quickly, I shoved him into my backpack, and picked up the other one. Walking over to the door and taking a deep breath, I opened it up, and was nearly punched by Travis as he was about to pound on the door again. Silently, I handed over the fake Tempe and hoped that Travis wouldn't notice. He grabbed the doll from me and panted angrily as he clearly wanted to hurt me in some way. Instead, he simply shoved Tempe into his coat pocket and grabbed me by the hair. I let out a shout and had to hold myself back from using the pocket knife right then and there. He tossed me to the ground and gave an angry huff. "You aren't the sweet little girl you used to be anymore," he chuckled, wiping his mouth angrily. I looked up at him and gave him an angry stare to match his own. Our staring contest was interrupted by John, who was awkwardly trying to get to the front door. We both looked over at him, and he quickly froze. "Can I leave now, sir?" he asked Travis, looking over at me before quickly breaking eye contact with me. Travis seemingly thought it over and nodded after a bit. That was all John needed as he quickly exited the shop, and once he had closed the door, I watched as he ran off at a full sprint. Travis turned his attention back to me and gave out a long sigh as he went behind the counter and pulled the seat out. "Sit down," he ordered from me. I carefully took my seat and made sure to keep a good distance from him. I looked at him, and his undead body gave me a sense of dread and sent chills all over my body. His chalk-white skin contrasted harshly with the bright red circles that dotted his cheeks, and it all just made me feel uneasy. But I swallowed it and thought back to my childhood, where I wasn't even so much as unnerved by the looks of Creel of Travis. "You really aren't the same Travis," I finally told him. Staring at him, and taking a deep sigh, he looked over at me and chuckled. "I don't know what you're talking about, Olivia. This is who I am," he told me, looking at me, and taking the fake Tempe out of his pocket, and tossing it onto the table. King Creel helped me see that I was meant to be like this, that I was better off being his assistant. Better off just listening to whatever he says, he said with a dreamlike smile. A little giggle came from his throat. And the day he let me off of the strings, I didn't even want to run. All I wanted to do was to make him proud. I felt sick to my stomach listening to him. It was like talking to someone with battered wife syndrome. "What a bunch of bullshit," I told him, really catching him off guard. The very notion of me being old enough to swear had seemingly caught him completely off guard. "Travis, do you remember the first time I came into the shop?" Staring at him, I waited for his answer. He seemed to rack his brain trying to remember. I remember that day perfectly. My mother had picked me up from school that day, and had stopped at the liquor store across the street from the Voodoo store. She told me to wait at the cashier stand while she went off and bought whatever it is that she wanted to drink that night. As I spoke, I felt Tempe squirming in my backpack but didn't think much of it at that moment. Way too focused on telling Travis my little story. As I stood there waiting for her, I turned and saw that Voodoo shop. I couldn't really read the sign well, but I knew what the little sign under it said. Free wishes. Bright-eyed me threw caution into the wind, and went to the store by myself. The feeling of crossing the street all by myself was enough to make me feel like I could handle anything in the store. I remember. Travis let out a tired chuckle. His face seemed to age slightly as the memories seemed to flood into his head. He looked over at me, and offered a more genuine smile than any he had offered me since I had entered the store. When I took Alexandra home that day, I didn't let her go for even a second, which got me in big trouble when I brought her to the dinner table. That was the last straw for my old mom. She grabbed Alexandra and threw her out of the window. And when I tried to stop her, I said, curling up slightly in the chair I was sitting in and looking down at the floor, I went to bed with lots of bruises and cuts that night. Travis said nothing as I took a few moments to compose myself. Remembering everything that my biological mother had done to me always caused intense anxiety and an overwhelming sense of fear. But I still went on with it, noticing that Travis seemed to be hung on my every word. After I was able to calm down, I continued. When I woke up, I fully expected to have lost Alexandra to some stray animal. So I carefully exited my bed and went to the kitchen. Except something was really off. Because instead of a soggy bowl of cereal waiting for me, there was a stack of pancakes waiting for me. My mother had never cooked me anything close to a real breakfast. And to wake up to a stack of pancakes was like seeing a unicorn out in the wild. I'm so glad you're awake. Those were the first words Alexandra had said to me. She was at the stove still making pancakes. She was wearing the same big black dress that she had worn as a doll. And in my childlike brain, it was like a fairy tale come true. Those pancakes were the best thing I had ever eaten. Needless to say, my mother was not too happy to see a random British lady in our house. Before anything horrible had happened, though, she started coughing up fluff. So she ran out of the house and left me with Alexandra, my new mom. I said with a smile and a chuckle. Looking up to Travis, I saw that he was nodding to himself. He was starting to remember a few things clearly. I remember that. She turned into a doll before my own eyes, and I gave her to you. Travis nodded. Those button eyes, while not telling me much about what he was thinking, did at least tell me that he was clearly not looking at me. He was in the middle of a 1,000-yard stare. She's been the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Travis, you don't need to serve an abusing, murderous monster like Creole. I just want you to come home and be with us. I told him, still hoping for something of the old Travis to be in there. He looked over at me, and then down at the floor, and let out a soft giggle. Oh, Livy. Poor sweet Livy. I like it here, he told me, walking over to me and stroking my head, causing me to shiver and stand up quickly from the chair and back away from him. I'm not a good person, Livy. I helped cover up the murders he did. I did a few of my own. I murdered my own parents. I almost murdered you and Alexandra. I am not a good person, and I deserve to be here, he said with a smile that sent pure dread into my body. As much as I didn't want to believe him, it all added up. If what his posts and my memories had told me. But I knew a different Travis. The big brother I always wanted. Who played with me, took me to school, and let me visit his college once he had finally gone. College. The friends he made. Turning on my heels, I went to go exit the store, a new plan forming in my mind. And I walked straight into the arms of a white tuxedo. Little Miss Olivia. It truly is a pleasure that you decided to come and give us a visit. King Creole hummed to me. Staring up in terror at the voodoo man before me, I couldn't even move as he reached up and put his arms on my shoulders. He was in a pristine white suit that was as white as his skin. His distinctive top hat was replaced by a hat that resembled a sun hat. He took a hold of me and turned me back around to walk back over to the counter where Travis eagerly awaited. "Welcome back, sir," he said with a sense of childlike excitement when a parent returned from an errand. Creel let out a soft chuckle as he pushed me a bit to the counter and stepped around me to join Travis behind the counter. "Travis, be a good boy and wait in the office for me," the Voodoo man ordered of his servant, who nodded without question and practically skipped over to the office door in excitement. When the office door closed completely, Creel looked over at me and motioned for me to sit back down in the chair that Travis had made me sit in. I weakly sat back down, stunned by how he looked now. "It's been so many years, little Miss Olivia," he said almost whimsically, placing his hand on the counter and leaning in towards me. "And you certainly grew up to be a charming young woman, with all the same spunk of the little girl who wandered in here hoping for a wish. The reminiscing would have been nice if it was with anyone but King Creole." "Sir, let me go, please. My mother will be worrying about me," I asked of him, not so much begging, but hoping that he would at least release me. He stared at me with those button eyes and offered me a crooked smile. Walking back around the desk, he stood before me with his arms crossed. "Is she now?" he asked, to which I nodded. His smile only grew wider. "You know something, Miss Olivia? You look the spitting image of Mary," he told me, which really caused me to panic. I had read Travis's story and I knew who Mary was and who she was to King Creole. The woman who had been his fiancée and the woman who, whether by choice or by ignorance, had led to King Creole's creation. "Do I?" asked him, standing up from the chair and trying to move away from him, only for him to grab me by the head and shove me back down into the chair. My hands instinctively went to the knife behind my back, and I had to fight the urge to stab him right then and there. "I never really had the chance to meet her," I told him after a moment of regathering my composure. "I suppose you didn't, but I'm sure you learned from Travis," Creel told me as he circled around my chair like a vulture over a dead body. I kept as calm as I could as I watched him circle me. Finally, he stopped in front of me and knelt down, so his button eyes met mine. "You can work here, Miss Olivia. I can offer you some amazing benefits, and I'm sure Travis would be more than happy to have you here," he told me, his smile so wide I was afraid his stitches would rip right through his skin. At that moment I decided to strike. Reaching behind my back, I pulled the knife out and stabbed it right through his face. I managed to drive it right between his eyes and deep into his face. He clearly wasn't expecting me to act out like this, because he stared at me in disbelief and staggered backward as a black sludge oozed from the knife still stuck in his face. Lifting my foot up, I shoved him away and made a break for the door to the shop. Reaching the door, I threw it open and ran out into the streets at a full sprint. I never was the most athletic kid at school, but adrenaline will push you to limits you never knew you had before. I don't know how I made it home, but my next memory is stumbling into the living room and nearly letting out a scream when Mom turned the light on. "You snuck out anyway?" she asked me in a stern voice, which turned to complete worry when she saw my face. She quickly ran over to me and took me into her arms, pushing my face into her chest. It was there that I began to cry uncontrollably. It finally hit me that Travis was gone, and I was never going to get him back. "I'm sorry, Mommy," I mumbled through hiccups and shallow breaths. She softly hushed me and rubbed my head lovingly. This always calmed me down without fail. And when I finally composed myself, I looked at her and wiped my eyes. "Travis runs the shop now. And King Creole has a white suit for some reason now," I said, still not fully understanding what the point of that was. I was worried that it would happen, but it seems that he has his filthy talons into Travis, and I doubt he'll ever let him go. Mom sighed, leading me over to the couch and walking to the kitchen to fix me something to eat. Sighing in defeat, I took my backpack off and opened it, taking Tempe out and giving him a tight squeeze. Mom came back a little bit later and handed me a small little sandwich and milk. Thanks. Setting Tempe aside, I took the plate and glass and started to eat my comfort sandwich. Going over what King Creole had told me, I looked up at Mom with a worried look and finally opened my mouth. He said I look like Mary, I told her, and that sent her into full-blown panic mode. Pack a bag. We're not staying here tonight, she told me quickly, standing up and starting to rush upstairs. I didn't even have time to question her as she quickly ran back downstairs with a bag in maybe less than a minute flat. Have you always had that? I asked her, stunned that she was ready so quickly. She nodded quickly and tossed me another bag that she had from behind her back. Catching it, I looked down at it and opened it up, surprised to find a bunch of neatly folded clothes. That's where my favorite shirt went, I said in glee. Come, sweetheart, we need to put as much distance between you and them, she told me as she started to make for the door. I followed after her quickly as I closed the bag and followed after her as she walked over to the car that we still had in my driveway from my old mother. Wait, you don't know how to drive, I told her, but when I saw her entering the passenger seat, I saw that there was a reason for that. I don't even know how to drive, I told her, handing her my bag. Before she even answered me though, I realized something. Shit. I forgot Tempe. I quickly ran back to the house and grabbed him from his little table perch. Forgot something, Olivia. I flinched in terror as Travis exited the kitchen, a knife twirling around in his hand as he approached me. I gripped Tempe close as I started to back up from him. He continued his approach as he'd scared and shook his head at me. Attacking my boss like that? You've gotten him very angry at you, he said, cornering me against a wall of the living room and grabbing me by the hair, knife held up to my throat. Don't hurt me, Travis, I begged of him, my body shaking in fear. He seemed to enjoy every second of my torment. He started to push the neck up against my throat. I held my breath so that I wouldn't brush up against the knife with my breathing. He took me by the cheek and softly caressed it, smiling at my squirming. I won't hurt you much, Livy. I'll make sure you're good and dead before I skin you alive. I know you'll make a beautiful doll, he said with a wicked grin as he momentarily took the knife away from my throat. It was a mistake on his part, as I quickly grabbed him by the shoulders and rammed my knee as hard as I could into his groin. He let out a noise between a scream and a moan as he collapsed to the floor, dropping the knife and reaching for his groin. I'm sorry, Travis, but fuck you, I said as I kicked him in the face and quickly grabbed the knife that he had dropped. I handed it to Tempe, and we both ran out of the house as fast as we could. Ignoring Mom's questions as to what happened, I quickly entered the car and threw it into reverse. Or at least I thought I did, because I ended up driving right into the garage door. Blushing in embarrassment, I then actually put it in reverse and exited our driveway. What happened in there? Mom finally asked me, buckling up and carefully taking the knife away from Tempe. Travis was there. He said he was going to skin me and turn me into a doll, I said in fear, my adrenaline pumping at 1,000,000 miles an hour as I drove us in no particular direction. Mom really didn't take too kindly to that, and started to look around in the glove box, pulling out a small pistol. Mom, when the hell did you get that? I asked her, never having known that we had a gun. Oh, I bought it a few years ago from a lovely gentleman in an alleyway, she said as if that was a normal thing to do. I sighed and shook my head, finding the humor in the situation, and letting out a pained chuckle. I tried to think of a place to go, and as I fiddled with my necklace I figured it out. At a stop sign, I pulled my phone out and pulled up the directions for Mama DuPont's. Mom was a little bit less than happy to be going back to a voodoo shop, but I managed to calm her down when I told her that Mama DuPont mostly likely hated Creole as much as we did. Arriving at her shop, I was thankful to see that it was still open this late at night. Hopefully, I wouldn't have to go to school come tomorrow. Knocking on the door to her shop, I was thankful to see her coming to open the door for me and Mom. I was worried this fate had befallen your brother, Mama DuPont said after I got her up to speed. She sighed as she sat down at her counter and offered us some seats to sit down in. That bastard has always loved to play and manipulate his prey. He is also one-minded in the sense of getting revenge on anyone who wronged him. And I'm afraid your little stunt of stabbing him in the face will only make your situation much worse. I rubbed my head in embarrassment and avoided my mom's intense gaze at me. Forgive me, Mama DuPont, but I would appreciate it if you gave me some time with my daughter, Mom said, and I could tell I was about to get an earful. Mama DuPont nodded and left me to my fate as she exited back into her office. You stabbed him in the face? She asked, completely in shock at what I had done. I nodded at her and avoided her gaze, giving Tempe a squeeze to try and protect me. Look, Mom. If I didn't, I don't think I would have been able to escape. He said I look like Mary. That's a pretty big red flag, don't you think? I asked her, and she had to agree with that. If I hadn't have gotten away from Creel, there was no way in hell I would have escaped. All right. I suppose we'll stay here until the morning and we'll figure out where to go from there. Mom stood up and went back into the office with Mama DuPont, probably to talk strategy. I took my backpack off and fished around inside for my snack, also pulling out the little notebook that Mama DuPont had given me. Handing Tempe half of a Kit Kat, I opened up the notebook and read it carefully. Mama DuPont was an amazing artist. Her style was like those who scribbled shadow drawings. Seeing King Creole in her style really sent me shivering at his grotesque look. It was like looking at Tim Burton's doodles of the Voodoo Man. Her entry for him was filled with things I already knew about him. His death and his powers, everything. Flipping to the next page, one came face to face with a page of a suited figure with a deep black shadow to him. Constantine Sinclair, I asked, flipping to his About page and giving it a read. The name sounded familiar to her, but she couldn't figure it out. Reading his passage didn't give me much more information either. Owner of Somber Rehab Center and piece of shit. Geez, Mama DuPont a little harsh. I wondered aloud as I flipped through the pages. Hearing a knocking at the door, I looked up and over at the door, and nearly shat myself as Creel stared back at me. He waved at me, and pointed at the doorknob. There was no way in hell I was going to do that, so I quickly scooped up everything, and ran into the back office. Creel is at the door, I told them, clinging to everything in my arms and looking at them with fear and terror on my face. They looked up at me and then at each other. Nodding, they walked over to me and helped me quickly pack my things back into my backpack. The charms protecting my shop should be enough to keep him at bay, but only for a little while. Both of you must leave the state. Once you do, that he'll lose track of you. Mama DuPont told us, quickly giving me a soft, almost motherly hug, and letting me go with Mom. Me and her quickly started for the back door. And when we opened it, I barely had any time to react upon seeing Travis standing there. She lifted her hands up to my cheek and held it as I saw the life leave her eyes. But she offered me a smile and managed to croak out some words. I love you so much. Before her arm went limp and she fell into my lap. Her blood got all over me as I hugged her and tried desperately to shake her and wake her up. My mother, Alexandra. The woman who saved me from an abusive mother and had raised me better than I could have ever asked for, died in my arms. I stared up at Travis as he entered the shop and held the knife up to his face, a hand on his face as he giggled at me. I stared up at him, almost ready to accept my fate, before Travis went stumbling backward, and sound returned to my ears as a gunshot rang out, and Travis went stumbling backward into the alleyway. Run, child. Mama DuPont yelled at me as she held up Alexandra's gun, having it still trained on Travis. I couldn't move, refusing to leave my mother's corpse. Mama Dupont came over to me and grabbed me by the collar, pulling me away from Mom despite my protests and screams. She shoved me out into the alleyway, shooting Travis again when he tried to stand back up and stop me. "Mommy," I whimpered, wanting to be with her again. Mama Dupont gave me another hug and gave me a squeeze. "Sweetheart, you need to run. Get as far away as you possibly can. Take this money, get yourself a hotel room, and don't open the door for anyone. Understand me? I'll be there eventually to pick you up," she told me, quickly shoving an envelope into my hands and starting to shove me away. Stumbling forward, it was seeing Creel staring back at me from the front door of Mama Dupont's store that finally got me to run away as fast as I could. I couldn't tell you how I got to this hotel, but I managed to do it. Get me a room and collapse into the bed, finally letting every ounce of emotion out as I cried uncontrollably. I had lost my only parent and it was all my own fault. If I hadn't been so stubborn in going to the voodoo shop, I never would have lost her. And now I had her die in my arms. And I was truly all alone in the world without her. Pulling Tempe out of my bag after hours of crying, I looked down at him and started crying all over again. "It's all my fault, Tempe," I mumbled to him, almost wanting to fling myself from the window of this hotel and just end it all. Maybe getting to join Mom in whatever afterlife existed. Tempe patted me softly and soon I looked down at him. He was pointing at the door. Raising my brow at him, I sniffled and walked over to the door, venturing a peek out into the hall. I was met with nothing out there. I looked back at Tempe in confusion, but instead of him, I was greeted by Charlie. "I'm sorry this happened, Olivia. I truly am," he told me, which only caused me to start crying all over again. Walking over to me, he wrapped his arms around me and gave me a tight hug, letting me get out all the crying I had left in my body. The knock on the door sent both of us shocked. I had put the "Do Not Disturb" sign up, so this was someone who was truly looking for me. Pushing Charlie out of the way, I quickly grabbed Tempe and ran into the bathroom as the door suddenly began to open. I got into the shower in time to hear a couple of footsteps walk into the hotel room. "I can't believe that idiot is us roped up in his shit again," came an unfamiliar male voice. Whoever this was, he started rummaging through my stuff and flipping things over. "He's got another stupid obsession. Over some bitch as well," he complained. "Can't be that bad. After all, at least it's a woman, and not that stupid puppet he made a whole project out of," came another male voice. This one was much less commanding, and it sounded like he was younger than the other man. He sounded almost approachable. "I could care less about what he's doing. Just find this bitch, so I can get this over with," the first voice ordered as things continued to be flipped and thrown around. I held my breath and Tempe close to me. Charlie had returned to his doll, and it was just the two of us hiding in the shower. I had closed the door just enough to make it seem like it had always been like that. However, suddenly a horrible smell invaded my sense and forced me to cover my nose and mouth. Things started being thrown around inside the bathroom, but I hadn't heard the door open at all. Suddenly the curtain was pulled away and I was face to face with a black creature covered in dripping black sludge. It was almost like some sort of shadow. It let out a soft gurgle noise as it stared down at me. Well, looks like we found Charlie's bitch," came the first male's voice. He came into the bathroom and revealed himself to be a tall blonde man with blue eyes. His look was one of supreme authority. He looked taken right out of an 1800s oil painting. The second man soon poked his head around the corner of the bathroom door and showed him to be a man in a surgeon's uniform with brown hair. Not a bad looker either. Needs a nose job though. Maybe even a little work on her cheeks. He pointed out at me, causing me to curl up in the tub as the two of them approached me. "Let's just kill her and get it over with," the blonde man said, the shadow seemingly agreeing with him. Moving closer to me and huffing a noxious, horrible breath into my face, causing me to gag and almost throw up. Seems like a waste of good material. Besides, Creel told us to bring her in alive, the surgeon said, smiling and taking out a small scalpel, though he never said anything about harming her. I started to hyperventilate and panic as this happened. And as he approached me, I passed out from fear and from everything that had happened, hoping to God that nothing too horrible would happen to me. Waking up with a violent jolt, I discovered that I had been tied down in a chair at the foot of a large table. Not tied down in the sense that I had a rope tied around me, but that I was chained to the chair by metal handcuffs. Looking around frantically, I saw that Travis was sitting next to me. He waved to me happily, and I stared at him with a mix of anger and absolute sorrow. My brother and the person I had tried to save had killed my mom in front of me, and had threatened to kill me. And now I was at the mercy of him and Creel. I'm so happy that you're joining us. Travis excitedly stood up from his chair and approached me. I tried to back up away from him, but it wasn't like I could do anything tied to this chair. So I had to sit and watch as he approached me and took a knife from the table and held it up to my throat. My squirming ended right there as he looked at me with sadistic glee. Shame about what happened to Alexandra. Travis scared in fake sorrow. His smile whitened as he pushed the knife into my throat. This caused me to whimper and start to cry as I watched him play with the fate of my life. The paleness of his skin and the deep red circles on his cheeks showed me that he wasn't my brother anymore. He was a psychopathic murderer. Don't mess with the table setting, a pissed-off voice told Travis, as an unseen hand reached out and smacked him across the face. He dropped the knife into my lap, but before I could do anything with it, it was lifted up by a dripping black hand. That horrible pungent smell filled my nostrils as I saw it was the blonde man and his strange living shadow. It was then that I put two and two together, seeing that this was the man who was in Mama DuPont's book. Yes, sir. Mr. Sinclair, Travis said submissively, backing up and sitting back in his chair like a scolded child. The blonde man revealed himself fully to me as he took his seat at the table and looked between the two of us like we were literal vermin. The fact you were even allowed to sit at this table is a fucking disgrace, Sinclair hissed. The anger in his voice was so pronounced that it was almost as if he was a few seconds from having an outburst. His dripping black shadow, on the other hand, was all smiles as it placed a napkin in Sinclair's lap and took a spot behind him. King Creel said I could sit with all of you, Travis said, avoiding eye contact with Sinclair's angry hazel eyes. This just seemed to piss Sinclair off more. Snapping at his shadow, who quickly came to his side and offered him a glass of water. The trio of us all sat in awkward silence before the rest of the group arrived. First up was Creel in that bright white suit he was now wearing. He took a seat next to Travis and nodded to him as Travis quickly unwrapped his napkin for him. Olivia, darling, it's such a pleasure that you could join our little dinner party, Creel said with a soft chuckle. I stared at him with nothing but anger and fear in my eyes. The man who had granted a wish that had saved me as a child had now captured me and was going to do who knew what to me. Speak for yourself, Charles, Sinclair scoffed, setting down his glass of water and staring over at the voodoo man. Creel's smile disappeared as he then kicked Sinclair under the table, getting a grunt and look of further rage out of Sinclair. His shadow must have thought it was the funniest shit ever though, as it let out a loud gurgle noise that I guess was its way of laughing. Children, stop fighting. There's enough of me to go around, a third voice scolded the two of them, looking over towards the door that was seemingly the entrance to this strange dining room. This new person definitely looked like he didn't belong here. He wore the outfit of a ringmaster, and his hair was bright white, with only a few streaks of black at the ends of his hair. A giant scar ran down his face, and he seemed completely ecstatic to be there. Great. You invited him, Sinclair groaned, shaking his head as his shadow offered him a cigar. The blonde man angrily took it and snipped the end off with one of those cigar cutter things. The ringmaster let out an annoying giggle as he sat right next to Sinclair and patted him on the back as he placed his cigar in his mouth. "Oh, come on, you know you missed me." Looking over at me, the ringmaster finally took note of me and left Sinclair alone as his shadow lit the cigar for him with a match. "Whoa, a woman. And Sinclair hasn't killed her yet. We really are in a new era." The man chuckled, looking down at his plate and silverware and playing with his fork. "Miss Olivia is my invited guest, Antonino. She's a dear old friend, so I hope we can make her feel welcomed," Creole said as he reached out and took a glass of wine from the middle of the table, lifting the glass up to his stitched mouth and taking careful sips. The ringmaster, presumably named Antonio, nodded and looked over at me. He offered a smile and offered a little wave at me. I avoided his eyes as they gave me an uncanny feeling to them. We all sat in awkward silence until 3 more people joined our awkward dinner party. First up was the surgeon who had been in my hotel room. He was all smiles when he arrived, but upon seeing Antonio in the seat that was next to Sinclair, his smile dipped a bit. "Doctor, it is good to see you," Antonio said with a smile as he offered the seat next to him. The surgeon nodded and sat next to him. Looking over at me, it was then that I took notice of his bright green eyes. They were almost like gems, and I couldn't help but stare at him in hopes of seeing them again. Only a nudge from Travis pulled my attention away from the surgeon. The last two to arrived together. A nurse pushing the wheelchair of a frail-looking figure entered through the door. The figure in the chair had a silver mask that covered his face, and a mess of black hair on top of his head. They took their place at the head of the table, the nurse sitting next to him, and wiping some drool that was falling from the masked man's face. His gaze seemingly focused solely on me. "Splendid. We're all here, let's eat, shall we?" Creole said with a smile, looking over at Travis and moving his hands, as if trying to get him to do something. It took Travis a moment to figure out what he meant until at last, he figured out what he was meant to do and stood up from his seat and went over to the door, and left. "You look ridiculous in that suit," Sinclair said through puffs of smoke. Creole looked over at him with a raised brow and let out a chuckle. "Travis runs the shop now. I can enjoy the finer things in life and relax while he runs it for me," Creole said with a smirk as he took another small sip of wine. Sinclair still looked disgusted by the whole thing, shaking his head, and took another sip of water. Travis soon returned with the dishes and set them out in front of everyone, excluding me since I couldn't exactly eat being tied up to the chair. Travis took his seat and soon everyone started to eat. Antonio, unlike everyone else who was using utensils, the ringmaster was using his hands and just eating off the plate. This was just more fuel to piss Sinclair off. And when Antonio got some random splat of food on his suit, it was the last straw. The blonde man cleaned his face off with a napkin, stood up, and decked Antonio right in the face with his fist. The ringmaster spat the food he had in his mouth out, and went down to the floor with a loud thud. "You disgusting cockroach. How many times must I teach you this lesson?" Sinclair spat. His shadow took position behind its master and let out another gurgle laugh. Antonio stood back up and gave his neck and had a good crack, looking over at Sinclair and decking him back in the face. "Maybe you should just try beating it into me some more." The ringmaster chuckled, waving his hand in front of him with a chuckle. The shadow didn't take too kindly to its master being struck, so it sunk its teeth into Antonio's shoulder. Sinclair shot back up from the floor and tackled Antonio to the floor. "Or for the love of God," Creole sighed, motioning for the doctor and Travis to pull them apart. They both came over and yanked the two of them away from each other. It was then I noticed that Antonio's face scar had ripped open, and a row of teeth gnashed and snapped at Sinclair, as Travis pulled him away from the blonde man. "Mademoiselle." Another voice suddenly broke the tension. I looked over at the masked man and assumed it had come from him. He was still staring at me. In fact, I don't think he ever stopped staring at me. His nurse was staring at me as well, and seemed to be eyeing me up in some sort of way. Monsieur LeBlanc, she is my guest. You will not touch her, Creel told the wheelchair-bound man. But he paid the voodoo man no attention as he kept staring at me. Suddenly he sat up from his chair. His body made loud and gross cracking noises as he seemed to grow taller. He hunched over as he climbed onto the table, revealing that he had 4 legs. His head snapped back and revealed a row of sharp teeth, and revealing that this wasn't a human. Before anyone could stop this creature before he broke out into a sprint on the table and tackled me as I let out the loudest scream I could muster. He snarled and leaned down to me with his mouth wide open. He started to claw at my clothes and started to try and do something with me. Luckily Travis hopped onto LeBlanc and managed to wrestle the creature off of me. Unbeknownst to him though, the creature had broken my chair and freed me. You shouldn't have brought a female here. The monotone voice of his nurse scolded as she approached and pulled a needle out from her bag. She gave a jab into the creature as it snarled and snapped in all directions. Soon it started to calm down and went limp. I took this moment to stand up and start running towards the door. My leg was grabbed by the black goopy hand of Sinclair's shadow, just as I was about to reach the door. Looking back, I saw that I was being watched with a grin by all the people in attendance. Sinclair was the only one without a smile. The shadow started to pull me back towards the table, looking over at anything I could use to stop my fate. Finally, I realized that I had the handcuffs around my wrists. Whipping them around, I struck Sinclair in the face as he approached me to pull me off of the doorknob. He let out an annoyed grunt, and his shadow let me go long enough for me to escape through the door, slamming it shut and locking it. Doubling it up by quickly shoving a table in front of the door, and looking around to try and see where it was that I had ended up. I was back at the voodoo shop. Although this wasn't the one I had visited Travis in. This was the original one. While it might have looked similar to Travis's, there was no mistaking this as the original. Looking around frantically for some kind of item that might help me, I was unable to find anything to help me. I searched behind the counter and tried to look into Creel's office. But all of it was for nothing as I couldn't find anything that might help me defend myself. I resolved to just make a run for it, but upon trying to open the door, I found that it had been chained shut from the inside. I was once again trapped with no way out. Taking some deep breaths to calm down, I finally looked down at my shredded clothes and tried to cover myself the best I could. I began to wish for Tempe to come and save me. But I had no idea what had happened to him after I had fainted in the hotel room. My best hope was that Sinclair and the surgeon had just left him there, and hopefully he would let Mama DuPont know where I was, or at least who had taken me. When loud banging began to come from the locked and barred door back to the dining room, I started panicking further. I looked around the floor for some sort of item, anything that could help me. That's when I noticed a pair of rusty scissors on the floor. Well, it was better than nothing. Picking them up, I held them close to my chest and tried using them to smash through the glass windows of the shop. But I was met with stiff resistance on the part of those windows, like they had been made to be bulletproof or something. My next swing was suddenly stopped by some unseen force when I held the scissors over my head to try and smash through the window again. Looking backward, I was met with a red-cheeked smile from Travis. Letting out a surprised shriek, I tried to pry my hand away from Travis's vice-like grip. You really are proving to be quite bothersome, he sighed, twisting the scissors out of my hand and tossing them to the floor. Turning me around, he slammed me hard against the door of the shop. I let out an almost pathetic scream as he took hold of my hair and brought the knife to my throat again. Travis, please, you're my brother. Please don't hurt me, I begged him, tears starting to stream down my face. He hesitated for a moment, the knife pulling away from my neck, and he let go of me. I quickly turned around to look at him and panted softly. He looked at me with a confused glare. We aren't related, Olivia. Why do you think I'm your brother? He asked, almost amazed that I had made any sort of comparison. I took a deep breath as I looked back at those happy few months where he had been in my life. The fun we had and just how amazing he had been to me. But you still treated me like a little sister. You took care of me, played with me, let me paint your nails. You were my big brother Travis. I told him, tears still falling from my face. He looked stunned as he seemed to have completely forgotten all of those things. His hands shook as he looked down at his knife, shaking his head and looking back at me. I'm sorry, Olivia, but I have my orders, he said, that twisted smile returning to his face as he began to approach me again. Thinking on pure survival instincts, I took my handcuffs and chains and used them to hit Travis in the face as I had done with Sinclair. He was stunned and dropped his knife to the floor as he stumbled backward. It almost happened in slow motion, like with what had happened to Alexandra. I leaned down to pick the knife up and lunged at Travis. He had no time to react as I plunged the knife into his chest. He let out a gurgled cough as black sludge began to pour out of his mouth in his stab wound. We both collapsed to the floor, with me on top of him. He stared up at me with a look of shock and confusion on his face. Slowly, however, his face took on a look of remembrance, and a true smile appeared on his face. Hey, Livy, he said weakly. My heart was filled with dread as I realized what I had done to him. Pulling away, I stared down in horror at what I had done. Travis, I am so sorry, I told him, trying to reach down and pull the knife out of his chest, but he stopped me, taking my arm and holding it around the knife. He still offered me a small smile as he coughed up more black sludge. It's okay, Livy. I'm so sorry I did this to you. I wasn't thinking right. I don't even know if I was thinking. It was all like a bad dream, he said with a pained chuckle which only caused me to cry even more. Travis reached up and wiped the tears from my eyes, and still offered me a smile. I need you to kill me before Creel shows up and makes me do it to you, he begged. Travis, no. I can't. Why, you're all I have left, I begged of him, refusing to do it to him. But he cupped my cheeks and kept wiping my tears. I looked over at him, and even though he had no eyes, I could tell all the pain that he had gone through. Everything I had ready had been through and done. Everything that had happened that I didn't know about. The key to the front door is in my pocket. Take it and run as far as you can, he pleaded with me. I hesitantly nodded and took the item from his pocket. I also reached out and grabbed the pair of scissors. I looked over at my brother and couldn't stop crying as I held the scissors to his neck. Thank you, Olivia, for everything, he told me with another smile, this one more sad but still genuine. I'm so sorry, Travis, I told him as I dug the scissors into his stitches and began cutting them. He kept holding on to me until the last stitch had been cut, and his head fell from his shoulders. My big brother, Travis, was finally free from the horrors he had been living through. And I was truly alone in the world. Standing up, I quickly went to the doors and stuck the key into the metal padlock and pulled the chains off them. I didn't even get 2 feet from the shop before I was grabbed from behind by some unseen person and pulled back into the Voodoo shop. Hitting the ground with a thud, I looked up, and my heart sank so far I thought it was going to drill through the earth. The whole cabal, as Mama DuPont's book had called them, had assembled to take stock of what had happened. Creel knelt over the decapitated corpse of Travis, and I could feel his anger and rage from where I had landed. He held up Travis's head and inspected it for any sign of life. And when he was sure there was none, he let it drop to the floor with a thud and began to approach me. You little bitch, he snarled, slapping me across the face and lifting his cane up to do even worse, before Sinclair stepped up and stopped him from bringing down the heavy cane on my head. This is why you don't get attached to shit, he explained, pushing Creel out of the way and approaching me. He looked down at me like I was some shit he had just stepped in. Shaking his head, he turned back to Creel and pointed at his cane. Use that and you'll kill her. Far too good a fate for her if she ruined your favorite project. He's right, sir. The surgeon spoke up as he approached me, getting on his knees and grabbing my face roughly, examining and nodding after a few seconds. Strike her too hard and you risk having her die too early. And it would be such a waste of this diamond in the rough. He chuckled, his shiny green eyes looking at me with want. We can always feed her to LeBlanc, Antonio spoke up, a smile on his face as he wiped some sauce from his mouth. Of course, since she is an orphan, I wouldn't be against eating her either. He chuckled, his scar splitting open and a tongue licking up the length of it. I shivered in fear at this group of monsters planning out what to do with me. No. I have a much better idea, Creole finally said. His anger was still obvious, but he suddenly got a wicked smile as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a mask. It was pure white and looked like it was made of porcelain. You really do have nothing original left, do you? Sinclair sighed, shaking his head and backing up from me as Creole approached me. Well, Miss Olivia, seems you're going to be my new store clerk, he said with a cackle, shoving the mask into my face. I screamed in pure agony as it began to melt and mold to my face. I thrashed and tried to get him off of me, but he just kept the mask against my face as it spread out across my whole body. The pain was so terrible I passed out. When I woke next, I was sitting at a counter in the Voodoo store that Travis had operated. And upon looking down at my body, I let out a scream so loud I thought my vocal cords would break. My whole body was made of porcelain. Waking up to find myself made of porcelain completely broke me mentally. Everything that I had tried to prevent had happened to me. I had lost my mom and my brother, and now it looked like I was going to lose my very life. While I was forced to sit at the counter of this empty shop, the office door flung open, and a cabal of creatures poured out of it. I wondered how they could have all fit in there, but that thought was thrown away when Creole approached me and slammed Travis's decapitated head onto the counter. You broke my shop, clerk, he said angrily, looking at me with nothing but rage and anger behind those button eyes. I tried to avoid his gaze, but he grabbed my face and forced me to look back at him. His anger was soon replaced by a crooked smile and a simple shrug. Shame, he lasted longer than the others. He was certainly my favorite. Creole chuckled, letting go of me, and picking the head up and tossing it to the floor with a loud thud. Why you hunted him over and over? How are you possibly over him so quickly? I asked, dumbfounded as I noticed the ringleader sneaking behind Creole and picking Travis's head up. Creole looked over at me and offered a snicker as he again grabbed my face roughly. 'Cause he ruined everything I built. So I made sure to ruin him till the point where he belonged solely to me. And you went and broke my property. Can't even fix him since you ensured his final and eternal rest. Creole sighed as he let me go. Then a split second later he slapped me across the face hard enough to crack my new porcelain skin. Lucky me, I found a replacement. Will you two behave yourselves? Sinclair suddenly shouted, suddenly pulling our attention over to the other cabal members. We watched Creole in annoyance and me in horror as Sinclair's shadow and the ringleader Antonio kicked Travis's head between the two of them. Creole scared and walked over, scooping the head up and scolding the two creatures. We don't want Sinclair blowing a gasket in my shop. Not to mention the two of you are ruining my floors. He pointed down at the black sludge that had stained the wooden floors of the Voodoo shop. Antonio shrugged but nodded in agreement. The shadow slithered back over to his master and hovered over his shoulder. Are we done here? I have a business to run. Sinclair sighed, taking a cigar out from his jacket pocket, before having it swiped by Creole, who pointed at the no smoking sign over at the door to the shop. The blond man stared at the Voodoo man in anger before swiping his cigar back and cutting the end off of it. You really shouldn't smoke, sir. The surgeon spoke up, coming from behind Sinclair and avoiding the wide-eyed gaze of his shadow as he walked over to me. His interest piqued with my porcelain skin. Ruins your body, he told Sinclair, while his attention was wholly focused on me, taking me by the face much softer than Creole, and examining me up and down. Spare me a lecture, Harrison. I quit drinking, like hell I'll quit smoking. He placed the cigar in his mouth, and his shadow was quick to strike a match for him. Taking a soft drag from the item in his mouth, he looked over at the pissed Creel and blew smoke right in his face. I wasn't able to see what was really going on as the surgeon, Harrison I figured, examined me with those big green eyes of his. You are a marvelous specimen. It's a wonderful thing to have your beauty preserved like this. Pity he didn't let me fix your nose before he did this to you. Otherwise, you look truly stunning, darling, Harrison said with a smile and a stroke of my cheek. I shivered as tears started to well in my eyes. Before Harrison could do anything else to me, his hand was smacked away by Creel's gloved hand. Hands off the merchandise, Dr. Harrison, Creel told him, shooing him away, and smiling at me as he lifted up his cane and beat it against his hand as he kept deep eye contact with me. I tried to back up, but my body refused to move. It felt as if it was stuck in place. You know, you truly do look just like her, Creel told me, just as he lifted up his cane and brought it down on my face. My face cracked open, and I went tumbling to the floor. Is that supposed to happen? Antonio's voice asked as I fell to the floor and more porcelain cracked and fell off my body. However, while those pieces fell off of me, I still felt fine. In fact, I was able to move those parts of my body now. Twisting my head and neck, I felt more of the porcelain crack and fall off of me. I moved my arms up to where he struck me and felt my skin there. And to my complete shock and surprise, I felt my regular skin. What in fresh hell? Creel asked, just as surprised and shocked as I was. I sat up and the rest of his porcelain shell fell off of my body, revealing that underneath it, I still had all my skin. Everything was normal underneath the porcelain shell that had surrounded my body. I looked up and shivered as the cabal members all gathered around to look at me. Looks like you're losing your touch, Creel. Antonio chuckled as looked over me. Somehow he had gotten a hold of Travis's head and was tossing it up and down like it was a ball. Sinclair, watching him act like a child, couldn't take it anymore and grabbed the head, tossing it as hard as he could into the wall. This can't happen. How the hell did you not turn into a doll? Creel screamed at me, reaching out and trying to grab me by the collar. As he tried to do so, he quickly pulled his hand back and scared in pain as it seemed to burn and sizzle. Reaching up to where he had tried to grab me, I felt a necklace around my throat. The one Mama DuPont had given me. I haven't lost my touch. She's got a protection necklace on, Creel hissed, holding onto his hand as it sizzled, and chunks of his flesh fell off. I held the necklace with my hand as I quickly stood up and began to back up towards the wall. The cabal members watched me the whole time, while Creel dealt with his melting hand. Stay away from me, I told them, getting some kind of comfort from the fact that they couldn't do anything to me. Mama DuPont's necklace had worked. She had feared the voodoo priestess had abandoned her, but in fact, she had never left her side. Well, if she doesn't want us approaching her, guess we won't have to stop LeBlanc. Antonio chuckled as he pointed to something behind me. Following his finger, I looked behind me, but finding nothing behind me, until a drip of water fell onto my head. Looking up slowly, I couldn't help but let out a scream when I saw the giant insect-like creature crawling on the ceiling. His eyeless gaze stared right at me as drool fell from his mouth. Since you can't finish her off, Charles, LeBlanc can do it for you, Sinclair said with the first smile I had ever seen on his face. Clearly, he was starting to enjoy my suffering. LeBlanc fell from the ceiling, landing on his 4 legs and standing up like some horrible centaur. I started to back up, before tripping and falling on something. Looking at what it was, I was met with the smiling cackle of Sinclair's shadow. Stay away from me, I shouted at LeBlanc as he started to slowly crawl over to me. I began to scan for any kind of weapon that could help me in this situation. Finally, my eyes fell on the counter and the baseball bat behind there. Well, that was one way to fight off a robber. Getting to my knees, I quickly curled over and grabbed the wooden bat. I see now why the Romans enjoyed gladiator fights. Sinclair chuckled again, puffing on his cigar with a satisfied face as he watched my struggle. Maybe if she kills LeBlanc, you can take over Garibaldi, Sinclair turned his attention over towards Antonio, who looked at him like he was an absolute genius. "She is an orphan. A bit on the older side, but an orphan either way," he said with some excitement, turning his attention over to me as I made some half-hearted swings at LeBlanc. The creature flinched back every time I swung as he tried to measure out a good moment to strike. "I promise to make it as painless as possible, madam," LeBlanc told me in a voice that in no way at all matched his monstrous appearance. He let his mouth dangle open, and the voice spilled out without the need for him to form the words. "You will make an excellent breeding body," he told me, causing my stomach to twist and a gag to come up from the pits of my stomach. Taking that opportunity, LeBlanc attacked me with a lunge. I was able to hit him in the head with the bat and throw off his charge. He slammed right into the counter and reduced it to splinters and pieces of wood. Panting, I backed up from LeBlanc as he tossed and screeched. "Great, another thing I need to replace," Creel groaned, planting his face into his good hand. This got a chuckle out of Sinclair as he happily puffed away on his cigar. I meanwhile was taking a good look around for some way to escape. But for Creel's character there was only one way out, and it was blocked by all the cabal members. "Sir?" a familiar voice asked as the front door opened. Everyone's attention turned towards John, who had just entered to start his shift. But clearly, he was confused, and a little bit scared of the giant creature that was only now standing up from the rubble of his desk. "Ah, Johnny boy. You're a bit early," Creel chuckled, walking over to John and putting an arm around him. He led the boy back outside, and I watched as John's gaze landed on Travis's head. With Creel gone, LeBlanc started crawling back over to me, ready for another attack. As he was again about to lunge at me, he was pulled back to the floor by Sinclair's shadow. "All right, now that he's gone I can end this charade." Sinclair stepped forward, still happily puffing away at his cigar, and looking down on me like I was some sort of fly stuck in flypaper. "Little girl, you should count yourself lucky. I'm going to cut a deal with you, so I don't have to keep chasing after you and reviving that top hat wearing idiot," Sinclair said, offering his hand to me to give up my bat. "Why would I even consider any offer from you freaks?" I told him, gripping my bat tight in my hands and raising it to swing at him. As if on cue, Sinclair's shadow let LeBlanc go and allowed the insect-like beast to tackle me, just as I turned to beat him with the bat. Down on the floor, LeBlanc snarled and gnashed his teeth at me as he again tried to rip my clothes to shreds. I did my best to get him off of me, but it was all in vain as he leaned down and sunk his teeth into my shoulder, getting a scream of pain out of me. "Maybe now you'll consider it," Sinclair told me, his shadow grabbing LeBlanc and yanking him off of me. The creature left deep in bleeding teeth marks behind in my shoulder as I sat up and scurried away from the creature. "Look, I could care less what you did to Charles, or whatever history you have with him. Knowing him, he'll hunt you to the ends of the earth for spiting him and destroying something he enjoyed playing with," Sinclair told me, tapping his cigar over me and getting ash all over me. "He's very persistent." Antonio nodded in agreement, looking over at Sinclair with a grin. Dr. Harrison also agreed, and LeBlanc was too busy snarling at me to really give any further input. I got to my feet, my bat still in hand as I looked between all of these people that had wanted to feed me to an insect creature in a suit a few moments ago. He killed my mom. And now he made me kill my brother. Why would I want to run from him? I told them all, holding the bat close to me and pointing it at Sinclair when he started to approach him. He simply kept walking and yanked the bat from me with ease. "Look here, bitch. I'm giving you one chance at never having to deal with us again. Even if you somehow manage to kill Charles all by yourself, we'll simply bring him back. That's our little deal. One of us dies, the others bring him back," he explained. Suddenly it all made sense. How Creel had returned all those times seemingly without a good explanation. They had revived him. "That's sort of our whole deal." Antonio nodded, putting his arm around Harrison, who was awkwardly trying to shuffle away from the white-haired ringleader. We have nice dinners, revive each other, hang out. We're like a cool kids club," Antonio said with excitement, getting a groan and shake of the head from Sinclair. "Ignore him. The deal I have for you is that I get Charles off your back, and you fuck off, and don't interfere with our dealings. Otherwise, well, I'll let Charles have all the fun he wants in dealing with you. He's taken your family, I'm sure there's ways for him to fuck you over some more," Sinclair told me, blowing a noxious cloud of smoke in my face, and sending me into a coughing fit. "What the hell are you trying to do, Constantine?" Creel's voice emerged from behind us. A growling of anger billowed from him. His face twisted in anger and rage at Sinclair. The blonde-haired businessman simply shrugged at him, and approached Creel, as if he was simply approaching a work colleague. "I'm stopping you from getting obsessed over another little shit, and dragging us down here another 4 or 5 times to bring you back from death. I'm done dealing with your shit, Charles. Let this one go and let me get back to Sombra. Let Antonio go back to his stupid circus. Let Dr. Harrison back to his plastic surgery, and let LeBlanc go back to trying to have a baby," he demanded from Creel, poking his finger into the voodoo man's chest. "What gives you the right to tell me what to do, Blondie?" Creel demanded to know, slapping Sinclair's hand away, and lifting his cane as if to smack him. Only to be stopped by Sinclair's shadow, who gripped Creel's cane, and prevented him from striking its master. "The favor you owe me," Sinclair told Creel, causing the voodoo man to stare at him like he had dug up some deep dark secret. Antonio yelled out in excitement, shaking Harrison back and forth, while he still had his arm around him. I quickly looked over at LeBlanc to see if he was about to come and attack me, but he had lost interest in me, and was crawling back over towards the office. There I saw his unamused nurse with his wheelchair waiting. "Hold on," I shouted out, getting everyone's attention with my sudden shout. "I haven't agreed to shit yet. No way in fucking hell," I screamed at them, lifting my bat up, and ready to swing at them. "Olivia dear," came a familiar voice from the door. Everyone's attention turned to it, and to my great relief it was Mama DuPont. She held in her hand a candle, and the mere sight of it sent Creel scurrying away like a cockroach exposed to light. I quickly ran over to her, and wrapped my arms around the woman, squeezing her tight, and thanking her a million times for coming to get me. "You dare to come into my shop with that thing?" Creel asked in anger, pointing his cane over at Mama DuPont and flinching back when she pointed the candle back at him. I got behind at Mama's direction, and held my back close. Looking over to the floor, I saw Travis's head and quickly leaned down, and picked it up. "This girl is under my protection now, King Creel, and you will do no more harm to her," she commanded, backing us up to the door. Sinclair looked at us like we were children playing pretend, and he shook his head. "You should have done my deal, little girl. This'll only piss him off more." Sinclair offered a shrug and one last puff from his cigar. "But I'll have no more part in this." He dropped his cigar to the floor, and stamped it out before turning to re-enter the office. His shadow followed behind him, and waved goodbye to me. "You can take her, but I'll get her back, and when I do, I'll make damn sure that she becomes my doll," Creel hissed at us, planting his cane on the ground, and grunted in anger as Mama DuPont led me and Travis's head out of the shop and out into the cool breeze. "Thank you for saving me," I whimpered as I dropped the bat and held Travis's head close to my chest. Mama DuPont didn't let her guard down until we were safely away from the voodoo shop, and she finally blew the candle she had out. Letting a sigh out, she turned around and gave me a tight squeeze. "I'm sorry about all this, sugar," she told me, stroking the back of my head, and getting me to cry uncontrollably into her neck as everything that had just happened bubbled forth and flooded me like a flash flood. We returned to her voodoo shop, where she wrapped me up in a blanket, and gave me some hot cocoa to calm down. She also took Travis's head to see if she could do anything. She had already told me that there was nothing she could do to save Mom. I looked over to the door constantly to see if Creel would come and get his revenge on me, but he didn't. Mama DuPont had told me that that candle would have helped his spirit finally move on to the other side if he had gotten too close to it. Explained why he was so afraid of it. I spent a few days with her in the shop, and eventually, she drove me to my house to gather a few clean clothes and other materials. As I was entering my room, I stopped and went into Mom's room. Everywhere were photos of us together as I grew up. I couldn't help but pick every one of them up and look at them. As I was about to leave, I saw an envelope made out of me on her pillow. Walking over and opening it, I looked down at it and read its contents. My dearest Olivia, words cannot describe the love I have for you. The day I was selected to be your new mother was the happiest of my long painful life. When I saw the horrible conditions in which you lived, I knew that I had to step up and become the mother you deserved. I never once thought of anything other than what was best for you. And I pride myself in seeing you turn into such a beautiful girl filled with life. I'm writing you this letter in case something happens to me and I have to leave you before my time is up. Know that the years I spent as your mother were the happiest of my entire life, and that I love you so very much. Your loving mother, Alexandra. The letter caused me to break down in grief, but also put a smile on my face as I did so. She always loved me, and she did everything she could possibly have done to raise me right. And she did it. Wiping my eyes, I was startled to see Charlie sitting on the bed waiting for me to finish. Hey, kiddo. Sorry, it took so long to find you. He told me, offering me Tempe and a hug as I cried into his shoulder about everything that happened to me. We sat and talked for a few minutes about my mom and about Travis. The whole time Charlie gave me this look of sad understanding. You're very special, Livy. He finally told me after a moment of silence. You don't know it, but you truly are a very special person. You can talk to me in this form and you could tell the future. If only slightly and vaguely. He told me, offering his hand to me. I took it and looked him in the eyes. What are you trying to tell me, Charlie? I asked him. To which he pointed down at the Tempe doll. This is a vessel for spirits. You can't save Alexandra's spirit. She's already moved on, unfortunately. But you might be able to save Travis. He told me. My eyes grew wide as he said that. I looked down at Tempe and then back up at him. What about you? Are you gonna share it with him? I asked him, to which he shook his head and offered a chuckle. I think it's time I finally move on, he told me, which got a quick shake of my head and a plead for me to stay. But he simply wiped my tears from my eyes and took my hands into his. When I was going to marry Mary, the similar words got a little giggle from him. All I ever wanted was a kid. And I got that with you, Olivia. Seeing you grow up and survive on your own. I couldn't be prouder, he told me, which got me a smile. I'm gonna miss you, Tempe, I said with a chuckle through tears, wiping my eyes and giving Charlie a tight hug. He returned it and pulled back, rubbing his arm and smiling back at me. Tell Travis if you see him again. I'm so sorry for everything Creel did to him, he told me as he started to fade away. I nodded and promised him. As Charles Sumner finally moved on, he let out one last sad but loving word. Mary. And he was gone. Taking the now empty Tempe doll, I walked back out and over to Mama DuPont. That night we held a seance with Trace's head and the empty Tempe doll. In the back of my mind, I kept saying a silent prayer that he would come back and be with me again. It took us many hours and we were on the verge of giving up. And then in a flash of light, Travis was sitting at the table rubbing his head in confusion. Travis. I shouted to him. He looked over at me in confusion at first, and then with a smile on his face, as we both hugged each other tight and let out tears of pure joy. Afterward, Mama DuPont put Travis's spirit into the empty Tempe doll, and Travis's spirit now resides inside of it. To make it feel like his body, I knitted him a little hoodie for him. Me and him spend our days working and helping out at Mama DuPont's. I still go to school, but this time with plenty of protection items to protect me. Travis definitely has difficulty adjusting to his new body, but he still brings me immense amounts of joy to have him with me. The last member of my family. But I won't just let them get away with this. All of them need to pay for what they did to me. But I can't just go in running blind and get myself killed. I need to read Mama DuPont's guide and make sure I know everything about them. Travis and Mama DuPont are behind me 100%. And in time, I'll take my revenge for Mom and for Travis. But for now, that's all I have to tell. For me and Travis. Stay away from all King Creel's half-priced Voodoo store.